Welcome everyone to the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series. Today we present designer and curator Prem Krishnamurthy. He's the founder of design studio Projects and the experimental gallery P! In New York City. I want to thank our partners for their support of today's presentation, AIGA Detroit, the University of Michigan Museum of Art, and Michigan Radio 91.7 FM. With the Thanksgiving season already upon us, this season here is rapidly coming to a close, so I printed a little sneak peek, not complete, of our winter season. You may have grabbed it on your way in. If you didn't, you can grab it on the way out. This is not the final calendar, but I have had so many people asking me about the calendar that I thought it high time to at least publish what we do know for sure. There are a couple of more dates, TBA, which should, and the final calendar should come out in a few weeks, but I thought I'd give you all that little sneak preview. And just a thought I had a few hours ago when I started talking to Prem, you know, it's just been barely a week now since the attacks on Beirut and then on Paris, and I know we're all greatly troubled by the continuously unfolding drama of terrorism across our world, and watching governments wrangle with how to find an effective method to eradicate the radicals, and trying to process the hatred and destruction that has been exacted. I thought, oh, Prem's visit is so fitting. A communication design, because really what makes us uniquely human is our ability to communicate, after all, each our individual perceptions of the world around us, and so thereby gaining greater and deeper understanding, creating compassion among us, which is so important. And so I say, you know, compassion is the combat tool, and communication is the tool for the weapon of compassion, if compassion can be thought of as a weapon. And in spite of all of these grave events, there's still much to be thankful for, and I'm wishing each one of you a peaceful Thanksgiving respite, smooth travels to those of you journeying. We will not be here next week, so take a moment to recognize and embrace the good things in your life, and I'll see you the week after. We will have a Q&A today in the screening room, as per usual. So if you want to join Prem there, exit the theater, go left down the corridor. We'll join you there directly after his stage presentation. Please do turn off your cell phones. And now, for a proper introduction of Prem's work today, I invited a good friend and curator from up the road who's been busy bringing great work to our fair corner of the world. She was responsible for the Nick Cave exhibition and event that happened earlier this season. Most recently, the exhibition which just closed at the Slusser Gallery, for those of you up on North Campus, the Common Room, connecting faculty from Eastern Michigan and the Stamp School. And just tomorrow, this weekend, opening a bevy of exhibitions, new exhibitions at the Cranbrook Art Museum, which you should go and see this weekend. The Lou Reed exhibition featuring Andy Warhol's Empire. They also have a Liz Cohen exhibition, and the Cranbrook Salon, which is works from the collection. No one else could do it but Cranbrook Art Museum's curator of contemporary art and design. Please welcome Laura Mott.
Hello. Thank you so much, Christina. It's my honor to be here today to introduce Prem Krishnamurthy, who is the founding principal of design studio Projects alongside Adam Michaels, and he's also the founder and curator of P! An exhibition space and gallery in New York's Chinatown that opened in 2012. I first met Prem a little over a decade ago. We were both in our 20s. And in my first year class at graduate school at the Center for Curatorial Studies at Bard College, we hired Projects when they were just a very young firm to create a small publication for us. And ever since, he's been a friend and an esteemed colleague, someone I hold very great respect for. And this moment kind of reminds me of advice I received when I was younger, that's often your peers that will be some of the most important people that you meet. And hence, one day, you blink, it's been a decade, and you're introducing them at the Penny Stamps Lecture Series. Over the last decade, Project Projects has worked with clients such as the Art Institute of Chicago, the Berkeley Art Museum, Columbia University School of Arts, Cooper Hewitt Museum, the Guggenheim Museum, Harvard University, the Istanbul Design Biennial, MoMA, the Whitney Museum, and this is just to name a few. And this year, Project Projects was the recipient of the Cooper Hewitt Museum's National Design Award for Communication Design, which is the USA's highest recognition given in the field. Prem also curates and runs P, which is a multidisciplinary exhibition space. And that exclamation point that's part of the title is also probably the best form of punctuation to equate with Prem. He has an ecstatic joy for ideas. It's contagious, you're about to see that. The program he runs at P is truly experimental. He's constantly reconfiguring the structure and form of exhibition making and the space itself. And he works with artists and collectives such as Mel Bachner, Judith Berry, Heman Chong, how do you say him in African, Elaine Lustig-Cohen, Brian O'Doherty, Saren Oppenheimer, Amy Siegel. Again, this is just to name a few. And some of his current projects that he's working on now is the signage for MoMA's new expansion, the branding, identity, and website for the Renaissance Society in Chicago, curatorial program and exhibition design for the permanent collection at the Bass Museum of Art. He's also teaching a practicum at Bard called Attention Economies that uses the model of Saturday Night Live to structure a 3-day live event at P. So also coming up this Saturday at 1 p.m., he'll be at Cranbrook Art Museum. He'll be our first guest in the Cranbrook Salon, and he's going to be talking about Charles and Ray Eames' sort of radical pedagogy. So this is open to the public, so please join us for that. And so without further ado, please join me in welcoming Prem Krishnamurthy.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great. Okay, well, thank you everyone for coming today. I can barely see you in these blinding lights, but I think there are many of you. In fact, maybe more of you than have ever been in a space that I've spoken at before. So thank you all for coming tonight. It's actually, I should say, this is the second time that I've ever been in Ann Arbor, and I wanted to kind of start my talk, which I call Detours, with a kind of site-specific kind of topic, as it were. I mean, today I called the talk Detours because I wanted to talk about the kind of meandering paths that people take through creative life. As Laura so generously introduced me with kind of a list of things that I can't even wrap my head around, but none of these things were really planned in a way. They come together in ways that are well beyond my own capacity to kind of understand how they are interconnected. And today I'm going to try to take you all through, let's say, 8 stops along the way, and see how those might connect. I'm going to start with the Rings of Saturn. And it's actually very related to this place because The Rings of Saturn, which is a novel by W.G. Sebald, the German author. The first time I read it was actually while stuck at the Detroit airport for about 10 hours in the year 2000. I was stuck there for 10 hours during thunderstorms, and I was reading this book in German, and I was kind of totally immersed in it. I thought it was amazing, and would just shuttle back and forth to Taco Bell occasionally to like get something to eat between reading this extremely heavy, dense book that follows a first-person narrator as he moves through the kind of English landscape, connecting objects and ideas, as well as histories, trying to connect colonialism and the silk trade with the history of medicine and any number of other topics. It's an exhaustive book, but not exhausting. One of the things about it is that it has this kind of idiosyncratic literary form. There are flowing sentences that are sometimes 2 or 3 pages at a time. And there are also, very importantly for me as a graphic designer, images embedded in the text. They don't have captions, they're not illustrations, and they function in a number of ways. The first time I ever read it, probably also because I was reading it in German, which I'm quite fluent in, but still not a native speaker of, I took it to be straightforward memoir. I thought it was basically an autobiographical novel. There's a narrator recounting coming out of a mental hospital, wandering through the landscape, and encountering these ideas. It was only really when I read it again for the second time in English a couple of years later that I realized it is a novel. It's of course, there are parts of it that may have some connection to kind of actual lived life, but it's also very, very self-conscious about its own form and its form as a fiction. There's structural conceits, there are mirrorings. It's a kind of so it's a kind of memoir embedded within a novel, or a novel embedded within a memoir, or something else entirely. And these images are a kind of core part of it. They're of uncertain provenance. When you look at them, at first they seem straightforward, what they're doing, but actually, where do they come from? Who took these images? Why do they look the way they are? And in fact, that's never explained within the book. So for me, this book, when I first read it, from the time I first read it in the year 2000 till now, it really is something that's a touchstone for me, not only in its graphic form and the way it weaves texts and images, but also how conceptually it weaves all of these different strands into something that unfolds over time. And maybe for me, there's something interesting about the biography of Sebald himself, the author, who died tragically at a very young age, but who wrote his first novel, I believe at the age 45. He had been an academic. He had worked as an academic in England, kind of in self-imposed exile from Germany for a very long time, and then came out with this brilliant first novel, Schwindelgefühle, translated as Vertigo in English. And the idea that sometimes ideas take a very long time to ripen is one that seems quite important to me. So since we're at a university, I'm going to start with something that I've never shown in public before. So this is actually work that I made in college, of all places, but I thought that maybe like the kind of slight tinge of embarrassment that I feel showing this will be like transmitted and create some sort of sense of empathy between us. Because in college, you're trying to figure out what you're doing, and I, at that time, was studying at Yale graphic design and photography. And so I decided to do this, but at the same time I was very interested in personal spaces, in performance, in literature, in all of these different things. And so I started to do, and ended up doing as my thesis project at Yale, a series of guided tours through people's personal spaces. So I would take a group of people through a set of apartments and explain what was going on in those apartments, but as if I were walking through a historical site. I would speak only about objects, and I would name each of the people only by their first initial, so as to maintain their anonymity. So I unearthed a little clip of this. So let's. Hey everyone, come on. Hey. Okay. So we're now going to head over to 228 Park Street, apartment number 12. And as you may have noticed in these two rooms, as I mentioned, all of those people had taken the trouble to paint their walls, despite the fact that they really were living in that space for quite a short time. I think that that's actually something very interesting about people living in college at this point in their lives, that most of them are living in a certain space for no more than 9 months, and then they're moving out of that space into another one. And I think that there's certain strategies for living which seem to crop up again and again, one of which is to try and make your place as homey as possible, which I think we've seen in some of these other places. Now moving into the apartment of P and H at 228 Park Street, apartment number 12, we'll see something that stands in opposition to that, which is to treat the space as essentially a functional space, as a transitional space, a space that's really just there for a certain amount of time. P has actually lived in this apartment since the beginning. Both of them have lived there since the beginning of this year, and P will be moving out in about 4 weeks. H will be continuing to live in this apartment. So of course it would be quite interesting to see how H lives in that apartment next year. Maybe as a biographical note, I should mention that one of my first and pretty unsuccessful jobs was trying to be a bilingual bus tour guide in Berlin while doing an internship there. But I also, for this project, specifically practiced being able to walk backwards with an umbrella, which was very important. So a skill that will take you very far in life, let me tell you. But as you heard, I was talking there about the apartment of P and H. And of course, although I didn't reveal it, P was myself. And this is my apartment then. So this was my apartment, my room during senior year. It's a little bit set up. I think I added a couple of things, but frankly, it doesn't look that different from my desk at Projects right now, which I tend to get in a lot of trouble for. But to me, the interesting thing was to take a kind of space of intimacy, a space of narrative, and try to apply a set of structures to it. A set of structures for naming objects, for thinking about them, for kind of working through these objects in a particular way and through the narrative that connects them. It was an early attempt, and for me, it was also this improvisation and the unexpected, and the kind of conflict of public and private that comes out that seems to keep recurring. About a year before that, before I did that work, I had already started to think about how to bring together the graphic design work I was making and the photography work I was making. This, for example, was a poster that I made for a class of the graphic designer Michael Rock. And it was simply a poster for the David Lynch film Blue Velvet. But the poster is this photograph. I made a poster that I then inserted into a room of a friend who, for some reason, had red velvet all over his walls, don't ask me why, and then rephotographed that, and the final poster was just the photograph. So it was an attempt to kind of put a thing inside of a thing. And I was also at the same time thinking about these questions of itineraries and journeys in other projects I was doing as an undergraduate, trying to take an issue of a magazine and spatialize the idea of the table of contents, putting it on the cover and actually letting people move from point to point. But also this idea that recurs of a thing within a thing. Here, for the last issue of the Yale Literary Magazine that I designed, I created and designed a magazine that then I rephotographed on a set of other backgrounds. So this became a magazine within a magazine that always spoke to something else. It both did its purpose of being a piece of graphic design and communicating, while also perhaps having a second function or a second evocative level to it. So I was quite fortunate at this point in time. After college, I got a Fulbright fellowship. I applied for a Fulbright fellowship as an art historian, which I most definitely was not and in no way qualified to be. And somehow they believed me and believed that I should go to Dresden in Germany and study East German design history, which was something I was quite interested in for ideological reasons, but frankly had pretty much no experience of, apart from having read some things and talked with people. So I found myself in Dresden, in former East Germany, for a year, from '99 to 2000, and started to formulate a project. And this project ended up becoming a kind of ethnographic survey or ethnographic project where I traveled around former East Germany interviewing East German designers, primarily architects and product designers, about their homes and workplaces before and after 1989, and conducting these long form interviews, sometimes 12 hours long, trying to kind of understand the changes that they'd undergone through their space. So in many ways, it was this year that was incredibly rich. It was unstructured except for my own structures, and that was a shock coming from college. And so I tried to kind of formulate this massive project. But I also had this sense at that moment in time, having come out of the kind of burnout of being in college and the intensity of it, that the conversations I was doing were themselves the work. And so in the end of the year, I was going to make an exhibition, and I didn't make it. I didn't make anything out of it. I ended up with a box of audio files, a set of 4x5 negatives, a lot of notes, a lot of notebooks, field notebooks as it were, and no end product. So in many ways, from that point forward, at first this was a conscious decision, but thinking back on it, by the time like a year or two had gone by, I started to feel like this was an extreme failure. And I mean, I think this is the first time I've probably ever said that I didn't finish my Fulbright project. I didn't finish it. And for years it haunted me. For years it haunted me as a signal that I wasn't actually an artist, that I wasn't able to pull something like that off without a structure to accompany me, without somebody else giving me a brief or telling me what to do. And so it's funny to look back at those years now and think, well, it was an incredibly rich year where so many of my ideas and the research that I've done was formed, but in fact, there was no product that came out of it. At the same time, this failure, this thing that I perceived as an absolute failure in my own character, actually became a really driving force for me to kind of try to up the intensity of everything I did. I moved to Berlin after my Fulbright and took a job as a graphic designer there. And I started to try and take these photographs, making a set of works of slideshows, double slideshow projections and projects that I would continue over years. And then moving into the idea of, well, maybe using my apartment as an exhibition space. And so I started to try and not only produce the graphic design I was doing as my day job, but also, as I'm sure many of you do, working on all of these other kinds of projects at the same time. And so my apartment in the Torstrasse in Berlin Mitte became a kind of space for exhibitions and events and other things. And one of the first projects I did there was a project I called Berlin Alltagstourismus, and this means Berlin everyday tourism. And it was, in a way, looking back on it, it was a transition from the idea of me making art myself to the idea of inviting other people to make art. Because I gave everyone a set of friends of mine a set of rules, which was simply to shoot a roll of 36 exposure film and include the letters BERLIN in that order somewhere in the contact sheet. They didn't need to be next to each other, they just need to be somewhere on the roll of film. And then I printed contact sheet from these that then became a kind of each a record of a certain journey, of a certain itinerary on a single day. And of course, this structure that everything could loosely hang around, these 6 letters actually become secondary to all the other things that are happening in the pictures and in the contact sheets. And this is here, that exhibition in my kitchen, which was my first exhibition space in a way, quite modest, but probably bigger than my whole apartment in New York right now, but that's the nature of real estate in Berlin. So our second stop is the exhibition that's currently on view at my gallery, P, or P exclamation, depending on how crazy you want people to think you are. It's an exhibition that's called Lost Shadows, and it's by the artist Vahap Avshar, and presented by P together with the nonprofit Proto-Cinema. Now, this is a deceptively simple project that's actually taken now about 2 or 3 years of conversations between Proto-Cinema and me and the artist to realize. In brief, Vahap is an artist who, for the last 5 years, he has been working through an archive that he acquired from a Turkish postcard company called the End Company. They were a company that produced postcards not for tourists, but for domestic usage in the 1970s and 80s. And they sent their photographers throughout the entire country to take pictures of every street corner, of banal scenes, of public demonstrations. Now, in going through this archive of over 15,000 images and negatives, Vahap started to find these kind of strange things. He started to find these images that would have on the envelope marked canceled or do not print. And he started to realize that there was a hidden narrative. Of course, there are many hidden narratives, but one hidden narrative within this archive was that these photographers, these anonymous photographers, had taken photographs that either they had kind of taken liberties to make them more artistic in a certain way, or they had done things that might reveal the state power, the state apparatus, because wherever these photographers would travel in Turkey, they would have to be shadowed by the secret police. And so we find these photographs of a beautiful landscape with a white Renault, which is the car of the secret police, or there are these weird men hanging, lurking in the corner of a photograph, looking at the photographer straight in the eye, who are probably the handlers of that photographer. And so Vahap took 12 of these transparencies and produced them as postcards, produced them as an edition of postcards that anybody can take from the gallery. And so what happens is that these images, which have never had a life before, suddenly they take on a new life, and these images, these images that themselves in their time may have been seditious, suddenly become something else. And here, actually, you see an image of a soldier looking at a postcard. And this, to me, is a very interesting thing. It shows the state power and also the way in which even somebody working as an anonymous photographer carries their own artistic voice. So the third stop on this tour is Project Projects. Project Projects is the graphic design studio that I started in 2004 with Adam Michaels. And speaking of postcards, this is actually a postcard, the first in a series of 3 that Adam and I produced in 2004 and 2005 when we had first started the studio. So we started this graphic design studio as 2 young designers who were quite unsatisfied with the state of graphic design in New York, and also finding that there were nobody was hiring. None of the people that we would want to work for were actually of a scale that they could take on a designer. And so both of us were considering going to graduate school, and then met and decided that we would start a graphic design studio together. And we started in a very scrappy way, but we also knew that we had to project another image. Even while we were kind of working out of our apartments before we had our first studio, we were trying to kind of project the image of a studio, a graphic design studio with the name and a website and all these things, because we had this kind of gut intuition, which was kind of true, that somehow being 2 people together, having a name and having a website would resonate better than just being a single person. Part of this, and frankly, part of our marketing ploy when we started was our first studio was on Beaver Street near Wall Street in the financial district of Manhattan. And it was a very strange area. There were no other graphic designers around there. We were in a studio that was shared with a Marxist art collective, and we were like these weird kind of people there who had a totally different schedule from the brokers and financial folk down there. And we found these weird spaces that our friends had never seen. And so we decided to take this set of very staged self-portraits of us in conversation in various public and private public spaces downtown, and then mail these out as postcards to people. And it became a kind of motif and a calling card, a way for us to say, well, we want to insert graphics into this environment, this strange environment, while also performing a kind of curatorial role of selecting these spaces that we think are quite weird and interesting. This being, for example, the public-private lobby of the Deutsche Bank building on Wall Street, where most of the people hanging out there are homeless people who actually, they become the kind of security power within there. When we started to take photographs of ourselves, they said, "You're not allowed to take photographs in here." And we had to say, well, we're doing an art project, and that's what got us through. So I'm going to show a very early project, which was one of our first projects in 2005 with the organization Creative Time, and it was a project called The Plane of Heaven, an exhibition that happened at the very end of the High Line. I'm sure many of you have heard about the High Line, and in fact, Robert Hammond, who is one of the founders of the Friends of the High Line, I believe he spoke here a couple of years ago. But in any case, it was an abandoned set of railway tracks that's since been converted into what is one of the most successful tourist destinations in New York. I think 7 million people visit there a year or something like that. But at that point in time, it was still an abandoned set of railroad tracks. And at the end of it was a building, a kind of, this kind of slaughterhouse, this chicken slaughterhouse that the curator Peter Ely, working with Creative Time, decided to turn into an exhibition that would look at the history of that site of Lower Manhattan and also think about the kind of sublime landscape. And he called the show The Plane of Heaven. And so we as a graphic design firm, we worked very closely to create a kind of custom typeface, a custom logo with a stenciled serif type that we thought was both industrial and also had a kind of refined classical quality to it. And of course, one of the things that it really allowed us to do was to apply it very directly to the building in a lot of ways. So this is that building at the end of the High Line, 820 Washington Street. And so weeks, actually at least a month or more before the exhibition opened, we actually spray painted the name of the exhibition and the name of the organization onto the building so that people walking around there would start to wonder, what's going on here? This is not typical graffiti. And this kind of way of applying the graphics became something that could really carry through the entire space so that we could be anywhere and add this kind of graphic mark that was a palimpsest on top of what already existed. Now, these things also didn't happen kind of without plan. Actually, we had spray painted the building in a very particular way and with one purpose in mind: the catalog. So the way that the building, the title of the show, and the title of the name of the organization were spray painted on the building allowed us to actually have the front and back cover of the catalog be the building. In many ways, we thought of this modest catalog as being a representation of this very idiosyncratic building. And it's important to note that this building was slated for demolition directly after the exhibition. And so in many ways, we saw it as being a kind of a holder for this building whose lifespan was very, very numbered. It was an exhibition catalog that had essays and, artist pages, all the typical trappings of an exhibition catalog, but it also had a kind of hidden narrative within it. Inside of each of the French folded pages was an image, and you could see them, but you couldn't quite figure out what was going on. And we wanted to create a situation where if you slit them open, they weren't perforated, they weren't made easy to open. If you slit them open, the images would actually be destroyed. In fact, the only way you could really see the images is to either rip it open from the spine or wait till the spine disintegrated. It was printed extremely cheaply, and we figured that they wouldn't last more than 5 or 10 years anyways before they fell apart. So we figured at some point in time, people having this catalog, the catalog would fall apart at the binding, and what would be exposed would be an entire set of photographs that I had taken that walked through this entire building, 820 Washington Street, and created a kind of narrative of a building that by then would be demolished. And in fact, at least maybe a year or two after the exhibition, the building was demolished, and for any of you who go to New York, that's now the end of the High Line and where the new Whitney Museum of American Art is. So there's a kind of absolute transformation that's happened in the last 10 years, but this little modest book might become a kind of time capsule of that earlier moment. Speaking of museums, the fourth stop on the tour is SALT, which is an institution in Istanbul. SALT is one of the most significant institutions or museums in Istanbul. They have 2 separate buildings in Istanbul as well as a venue in Ankara. And SALT has a very unusual kind of mission. As you can see here, they don't even say in their mission statement the word art. But what they think of themselves is as a hybrid institution, a kind of mix of contemporary art, architecture, and also research into material culture. And this is because of it was the fusion of 3 organizations that existed before that have come together to form this very interesting and critical institution. So we were invited in 2009, 2010 to pitch an identity for this new institution. And the first thing that we thought was, well, this is an institution who has as one of its platforms design. So why do we want to create just a kind of branding system, just a logo or something that they can slap onto things that projects outwards? What if we could actually treat the identity system of the institution as itself part of the curatorial program? What that meant was that we proposed to the institution that there would be no fixed mark, no logo, no kind of static symbol for the institution, but instead a custom typeface where the letters SALT are somehow changed, that they stand out within the midst of a block of text, but actually it never calls itself out first and foremost as a kind of institution. But the second step of that is that we said we want to treat this identity and this typeface as a kind of exhibition. Every 4 to 6 months, we want to invite other designers from around the world to redesign those 4 letters, SALT, and through that, create an entirely new identity and new typeface, which is used for everything that the institution communicates with. And so this has been an ongoing program now since the founding of the institution, where we've had people from Indonesia, from France, from the US, from Istanbul itself, everyone from collectives to art schools to individual designers create a kind of increasingly diverse set of typographies that function like a kind of timestamp. Anytime you look at any material in a building, a piece of signage, or a poster, but also on the website, you can see exactly when it was made visually through knowing which typeface was used in that time. And furthermore, and this is yet another step, but I won't even go into that, we wanted to let this identity exist in the world in other ways. And so actually, for any of those of you who are interested, if you go to the website of SALT, anybody who can look at the code of it and the CSS of the website can actually easily download the fonts themselves. Because we thought, in an age of kind of sharing and file sharing and Russian sites where you can download any typeface, no matter how proprietary, how antiquated is it to think that you should hold on to a custom typeface as your own? Instead, what if we let people steal it? It's still going to look like SALT no matter where people use it. And so let's let people steal it from the website. And that's been very interesting to see how people have actually taken it and used it to their own ends. and overall how the kind of space itself has changed. It's really embraced this idea that rather than having a fixed identity, change itself can become an identity. The fifth stop on our tour is P and K. K. I should do that even more seriously. I'll explain what that means. I think that one of the most kind of significant projects that Adam and I have completed in the past 12 years is still, for me, this book, Matrix, A Changing Exhibition of Contemporary Art. It was a 2-year project. We worked very closely with the curator of the Matrix program, Elizabeth Thomas, to go through the archive of an exhibition program at the Berkeley Art Museum. So this exhibition program started in 1978, and at the moment in which we came into the project, there had already been 227 exhibitions that they had done. It was one of the most important, it was one of the first one of the first project spaces at a West Coast museum in the US, and it had this very scrappy approach in the beginning to how exhibitions were made. And one of the things is we went through all of the archives, all the correspondence, the images, the materials from the curators, and found these kind of interesting trends, how in the beginning you would have artists and curators working very directly. A curator would say to an artist, okay, let's do a show, we've got $500 and we can bring you out here. In later years, you see that actually correspondence happens between the curator and a gallery, and there become all these kind of other institutionalized apparatuses that take the place of that kind of direct conversation. But for us, for me, I should say, it was like a kind of graduate education in curatorial practice, because by going through these archives, I came to understand how these exhibitions were made, and this project became the 228th Matrix project, this 560-page tome, which kind of encapsulates the entire program. And so this project was really on my mind when, in 2012, I decided to open an exhibition space on the Lower East Side, or Chinatown, depending on whom you speak with. And that is P. So P is a space, I say it's a space in Chinatown because actually the neighborhood that people call the Lower East Side can also be called Chinatown, depending on who's looking at it. You have a highly contested area where there are galleries vying with Chinese businesses, and neither one of these kind of neighborhoods or communities actually speaks to each other. But in any case, I'll leave that for another talk. I wanted to, I decided to start a space that would embody this kind of ethos of a space that can be very flexible, that can be unfixed, that can be changing, and that can take a lot of risks. And being a graphic designer, of course, the first thing I did was think about the identity program itself on a visual level as being something that could embody that. And so there's actually no fixed logo or mark or even typography for P. In the first 2.5 years, an artist or somebody from every show would contribute a mark, or each show would have its own typography, its own kind of press release with just a frame that kind of gave you the basic information, which told you that this was P. And for me, that was very important because I wanted to think about the graphics of it and its language, even the way in which it spoke, the institution spoke, being tailored to every single individual project, rather than trying to fit each project, fit each exhibition into a mold. And this was in the very beginning also expressed through our Mad Lib mission statement, which was kind of this thing that I realized walking around the Lower East Side, that none of the galleries on the Lower East Side even have, in that day, nobody even had their name on them. Or if they did, it was tiny. Most of them had a number, and the idea was that actually only the people who really know that this is a gallery are going to come in here. Anybody else off the street is never going to feel like they're welcome, feel like they can come through the door. And so I wanted to try and kind of invert that relationship and try something new here. So for P, we had the mission statement both in English and Chinese with open spaces for people to fill in, and for it to be something that could change over time. And there was something that was intentionally a little childish or playful about this, but to me it kind of was a way to say, this is not a kind of gallery that's functioning in quite the same way as other spaces here. The space is a storefront, and that public presence is very, very important to me. The fact that it's not a second floor space, it's not a space that's private, but it's a space that people kind of are confronted with and can engage with whether or not they decide to walk through the door. At the same time, the space itself is an active participant in the exhibitions. And here you can see the very first exhibition that we did at P that I curated, which was a show called Process 01 Joy, a very unwieldy title. I'm terrible at titling things because I seem to have too much of a propensity for word games. But this first show that we did was actually, for me, really exciting. In retrospect, it was a way to test out 3 different modes of making an exhibition in one show. So this 3-person show had, on the one hand, the work of Chauncey Hare, who had completely withdrawn from his practice as an artist and photographer, a kind of activist photographer in the 70s and 80s. And so I was working almost like an exhibition designer with just reproductions of materials that I was putting in vitrines, and he was not involved in any way, really. So there I was working almost as an exhibition designer, which is a mode I know very well. On the other hand, Karl Martens, who many of you who are graphic designers might know, is a 76-year-old Dutch graphic designer, but also an artist or a artist, graphic designer. He doesn't call himself an artist. It's always so complicated. But somebody who has made an incredible body of these letterpress monoprints since the 50s that had never really been exhibited before this. And so I actually, like a kind of classical curator in a way, worked with him, went to his studio, did a number of studio visits, selected a set of works, and just figured out with him how to display them, how to put them into the space. And the third mode of curating was actually Christine Hill, who runs something called Volksboutique, and was one of the first artists in the 90s working with what was then called relational aesthetics, or what was later dubbed relational aesthetics. Christine Hill actually kind of instrumentalized me as the gallerist. Like, actually, I or whoever was sitting at the gallery during a given day had to sit at that desk that was chosen by her, that had been used in other projects of hers, engage with visitors in a very particular way, and carry out a set of tasks for her. As you can see on the wall, it says, we were the Volksboutique Small Business Outpost, Chinatown Division, and we specialize in collecting local small business talismans, what does it say? Vernacular signage to present and preserve. And so what that actually meant is that every week we would go to different businesses in the neighborhood, find out who had a handwritten or kind of non-mass-produced sign, ask them if we could borrow it, make a new sign for them, and then switch signs with them for the duration of the show and hang that in the window. And that was the project that we executed for her, and in a way, only we could have done that because we were also I'm a graphic designer as well as being a gallerist, so I could use that kind of unique confluence. As I said, the space is an active actor in everything. And so we've gone so far as to change the physical envelope of the space, even for short periods of time, as in this project by Sarah. But it's also a space where I think discourse is very important and community is very important. So we've once converted the entire space into a reading room for a 1-month show. And it's very interesting. I think people always think that when you become something new, that you're going to do that forever. Like, I remember when we brought in these designers, Rich Brilliant Willing, whom we worked with, to create this reading room for a show, and everybody said to me, "Oh, are you going to be a bookstore or a reading room now?" And I said, "No, this is just an exhibition. It's 1 month, and then we're going to be something else the next month." But somehow that idea, it took a while for people to realize that literally, from show to show, we are going to radically change the way that we displayed things, and we are going to try to actually actively think about the conditions of the space within the curating and the organization of every show. Maybe one of the most extreme examples of that, but also for me one of the most fun, was a show called The Ceiling Should Be Green that I did together with the artist and curator Ali Wong. And so this was a show, I was really interested in the idea that we take for granted that architects and exhibition designers and curators know something about space, and they're authorities on space. And I thought, well, there are other kinds of authorities on space. Why can't we ask them what they think? And Ali Wong, who comes from Hong Kong, had proposed to me that she would bring in a feng shui master Mr. Ye, whom she had worked with before while in graduate school, to first of all read our space and tell us what the space needed, and then to choose all the artists from a set of artists' birthdays and birthplaces that we gave him. So we simply met with him, paid him his consulting fee, and he told us, for example, that we had already had a red floor, which was the remnant of Christine Hill's first project at P, and he said, well, you really need a green ceiling to balance it out, and you should make the floor green in the foyer, and told us a number of other improvements that we should do, which we dutifully did, and then he also chose all the artists. We gave him a list of birthdays, and we gave him 15 artists, and he chose 9 artists who he said were good, and he told us which ones were good and which ones were bad, and then he helped us to hang the show and told us where we should put things. And in fact, I think in many ways it was one of the best shows we've ever done, because he cut through all the bullshit. It was just like, okay, this is where things should go, or who knows, but in any case, it was another way to organize the space that suddenly opened up a whole new field of possibilities. I mean, for me, one of the kind of core texts within all of this is, of course, Brian O'Doherty's Inside the White Cube, which was first published as a series of essays in Artforum and then later collected into a book. And this is the famous set of essays in which Brian O'Doherty, who is a critic, artist, novelist, and more, and medical doctor and more, basically took apart the kind of ideology of the white cube, how the white cube, like a kind of sacral space, like being in church, creates the value of the objects within it. And so for me, it's always interesting to think through other modes to this, and also to think through how to engage with those histories very directly. I mean, it's my distinct pleasure that we now work with Brian O'Doherty together with Simone Subal. He's 88 years old. He's still making work. He's an amazing artist and one of the most important thinkers of the last century in this one. And we've done solo shows with him, and even in those, trying to take both contemporary and historical materials and finding new ways to kind of display them, new ways that kind of go out of the normative modes of display. Or in other cases, working with older artists like Elaine Lustig Cohen, who's 87 years old, but pairing her together with a younger artist like Heeman Chong and trying to create unusual resonances between their work and thinking about these historical and contemporary works as being able to simultaneously coexist in a space in a particular way. This kind of multi-directionality of things is very important to me as well. Sometimes it comes not only from the curatorial into the graphic design, but from the graphic design into the curatorial, as it were. This is a book that I had edited with 2 other editors, Karen Kwoni and Vijayanthi Rao, called Speculation Now. And we worked a number of years on commissioning the text and editing it. Ultimately, Projects designed the book as well. But out of this book came then a set of exhibitions that Karen and I did in the space that we called Post-Speculation. But to give a little anecdote, I mean, we were planning this set of shows called Post-Speculation, and then this was about a year ago. This was August of 2014. Suddenly, the events in Ferguson happened, and the whole climate of things in the US started to change for us. And our own sense of what this exhibition ought to be started to shift as well. And so we started to shift our program, and we actually invited the collective How Do You Say Yam in African, a number of members of the collective, to do a residency at the space in August to develop an exhibition. And so what they did is they were there in the space for August and then developed in a very, very short time frame an exhibition that was only really up for a week that they called The Way Black Machine. It was a 24-channel projection, a 24-channel installation that captured the social media responses to Ferguson. And it was something that was incredibly kind of urgent and timely, and it forced us to reconfigure our entire program, but I'm so glad that we did, because we did that and then made a kind of second iteration of this same exhibition that maintained the condition of the space before, but then overlaid a number of other artistic voices so that there's this kind of multiple temporalities are overlapping in the space. Now, the problem with doing something like P or anything for a while is that you start to get known for something. You know, after about 2.5 years of running P, we were known as this crazy space on Broome Street in Manhattan that was always playing with exhibition display, and people almost like came to expect that they were gonna walk in and see something challenging on that way. And I should say personally at that moment, I realized that up until then, almost all of the shows, with only a couple of exceptions, had been group shows curated by me or with other curators. And I realized that the form of the solo exhibition was one that I hadn't really tackled up until then. Also, at the same time, it seemed like the art market was something that was looming in everybody's minds, like the overpowering, the overpowering influence of the art market and of auction sales and all these things that hopefully none of you will have to think about for a very long time that are really depressing in New York. So, and post-speculation and speculation itself had dealt with some of these topics as well. And so I decided to kind of radically change what P was and to actually kind of change the program with a very specific program. So in the beginning of 2015, we ripped out everything in the entire space. We ripped out everything that had been in there, all of the layers of kind of artistic and architectural gesture that had accrued over time, and reopened as K. So whereas P was a multidisciplinary exhibition space in Chinatown, K is a new gallery on the Lower East Side. Just a gallery, nothing to see here, you know, just a normal gallery with white walls, but we wanted to, of course, tweak that a little bit. What I thought of K as is a kind of Bildungsroman, a narrative of an entire gallery packed into 6 months. So over the course of 6 months, we did 6 exhibitions that were each 2 or 3 weeks long that somehow went between being an exhibition and an art fair booth, which sadly is where so much contemporary art is seen these days. It's really depressing, but that's the nature of things. And so we wanted to kind of actually speed up our exhibition making and use it as an opportunity to experiment with things in a different way. And so these 6 shows, which we laid out from the beginning, were almost all kind of solo shows or of a very different kind than what we had done before, but they happened in quick succession. So we kicked off with a show called Real Flow, where instead of selling artworks, we were actually selling financial instruments. We were selling derivatives on the value of artworks, which confused the hell out of everybody, which was kind of the point. In a second show, we had a show by 2 young recent MFA graduates, Aaron Gemmel and Matthew Schrader, who worked collaboratively to create an installation piece. Then we had the artist Kit Yi Wong, who was actually the same person as Ali Wong, who did the Ceiling Should Be Green show. Just as a curator, she has one name. As an artist, she has another. So she created a show and a project in which she was selling future bonds in a set of performances that she would make in the North Pole. And interestingly enough, that was our best-selling show. A lot of people wanted to buy promissory notes for future performances. So, and she actually then just went to the North Pole in October and created a set of 6 projects that were commissioned to her with a very specific set of variables that are incredible. But it's really the kind of authority of the gallery. It's the authority of having a gallery space that makes people believe things. And this was a way to test that question of the white cube. Here we were working with Matthew Hale, who created these panels painted with magnetic paint, where images could be freely rearranged like one of Abby Warburg's kind of sets of images. And then it kind of became even more self-reflexive with the Israeli artist Michael Helfman making a show that appeared to convert the gallery into a currency exchange booth. And our very first visitor walked in and asked if they could exchange currency, but actually there was a kind of front room, back room relationship, and we were only exchanging currencies of countries currently at war or where the currency was unstable. So people could buy Syrian currency, they could buy currency from Afghanistan, they could buy currency from other countries at war, but only those countries would be available there. And then the final show, curated by Sarah Romack, was a show called Egress, appropriately enough, a kind of exit from K. And so K ended with this show that looked at the body and the digital, and then expired. After that, K disappeared. There's no more website for K. K is as if it never existed. And people still kind of think, oh, that was like a different space. Somebody else took it over, or what happened there? But in a way, we've just reintegrated it into our program as we think through what the next set of challenges are. And I mean, I think for me in particular, one of the interesting things is how to move beyond the exhibition space itself, sometimes in the art fair, sometimes in thinking through how to make something in this very normative context that can still stand out and be experiential. sometimes by working with institutions to kind of work with Elaine Lustig Cohen, for example, and the Philip Johnson Glass House to kind of make presentations of work that never would have been possible before. Sometimes going back to my roots, as it were, and doing apartment shows with people, like this show of Carl Martin's work that I organized with Emily King, and sometimes trying to break out of the kind of gallery context entirely, or at least to think about how an artwork can be participatory and grow, like this installation, this fungus installation by the Dutch design collective Moniker. And I think that the most recent thing, which is also for us a kind of watershed, is a project called Container Residency, a Container Artist Residency 01. And so for the first time ever, and in Project's history and my own, this is a project where I was invited to curate a project that is a residency program created by an artist that will happen on commercial shipping, commercial cargo ships. And I was invited to curate it, and what we decided to do was combine the curatorial and the graphic design and the publishing. We're also going to be the publishers of the book for this program, and in a way to bring all of those things together into a single package. And we'll see if it's successful or not as a project, but as a model for working, it's quite interesting because it suggests a way to bring everything together and for graphic design to still be at the core within these kind of other concerns. Our sixth stop, following on that, is the exhibition Graphic Design Now in Production. And this was an exhibition that started at the Walker Arts Center that was curated by Andrew Blauvelt and Ellen Lupton, and then traveled to New York and a number of other venues. And for us, it was a show that was extremely close to our heart. It was the most important show of graphic design that had been created in America in the last 15 years. And it started from the premise that graphic design happens now in an expanded field, that graphic designers are functioning as producers, as editors, as curators, as authors, and that actually the definition of graphic design is expanding in all of these different ways. So we were thrilled to work on this, but it was a very challenging project. It was I'll be honest, and I think Andrew's probably in the audience too, he knows this. It was to do the show in New York with the Cooper Hewitt was very, very challenging, primarily because of the location. Because this show in New York happened on Governor's Island, an island that's between Manhattan and Brooklyn, and it's incredibly seductive for a number of reasons. Because in the summer there's a free ferry that runs there, 10,000 people visit every day. It's great, but the building in which we were working had all of these kind of problems from a kind of the standpoint of the Smithsonian Institute and the federal government. I won't even go into that because it'll be a little I'll lose my stuff. So, but the point is that it was a show that was also geared to a broad public. And so what we wanted to, in the graphic design and the exhibition design of the show, from the get-go, when people landed on Governor's Island, they could go to any number of locations, but they could also find graphic design somewhere. And that for us was like a gesture. We wanted to actually say, most people, like my mother still doesn't really know what graphic design is. And, like I've been doing this for long enough that she should finally understand it. But it's fine. At least she thinks she's proud of me. It doesn't matter. But we wanted to take the opportunity to actually bring at least some proportion of these 10,000 people coming on to Governor's Island every day in contact with graphic design. And there we had a real advantage because we had a smaller space in New York than in the Walker, but we also had the only bathrooms on Governor's Island. So in this little hallway, and so every single person who came to Governor's Island on a summer day and drank a lot of water was probably gonna end up there in this little crappy hallway at some point in time. And so rather than treating that as a kind of ugly space, we actually said, how can we transform this and turn it into a kind of teaser of the entire show? So actually, this hallway became something that was almost a kind of cut through of the entire exhibition, where if that's the only thing that somebody saw, they would at least have some better idea of what graphic design was. And then, as I mentioned, the space itself that the show was in was very challenging. It had this column grid that was very, very tricky. And so we wanted to kind of work with that, but also create a kind of legibility on a graphic level, creating a set of corridors for flow, but that were very clearly kind of divided into sections and cut through with these large graphic voids, and to color code the different sections of the exhibition so that people could find the things they were looking for, and to allow for a kind of movement and permeability between these sections. So this, for us, was a kind of way of really trying to think through the space of a graphic design exhibition. And I showed at the beginning of this, one of the key points of this project too for us was the banner for the show, where we took the idea of production very literally and we put up a 1-to-1 scale image outside of the Governor's Island Ferry of our studio producing the graphics for the exhibition. And you know, this is now, this was our old studio where we did that, but you can kind of see that like this kind of sense of, well, okay, somehow exposing, even in a staged way, the way in which graphic design is made seemed very important to us. Okay. So the 7th stop is a recent show at P, which is called Pangrammar. And this show is really, for me, like a return home. It's almost like an homage to various ideas and people and works that have formed me. It mixes objects from all kinds of different periods in time with a simple premise. I'm going to show a piece. This is actually a piece made for the show by Dexter Sinister, who are graphic designers and artists, in which they have a robot voice reading the press release of our show. So pay close attention.
Pangrammar. September the 18th through November the 1st, 2015.
P.
334 Broome Street, New York City. Like the poet Brown Fox, that jumps over a lazy dog. Pangrammar is a group exhibition of over 26 words that each depict a single letter. These objects include pieces of art and design, ranging from contemporary to historical, mass-produced to unique, in 2, 3, and 4 dimensions. Over the course of the show's run, Pangrammar will rearrange itself periodically to spell different sentences and create new meaning. Jackdaws love my big sphinx of chords.
So, in brief, there are a number of works from all periods by designers, artists, whatever, that are all a single letter. They're rearranged to spell different pangrams, a pangram being any sentence that has all 26 letters of the alphabet in it. So, I'll walk you through the first iteration of this exhibition. Can you bring the lights up? So we have a T by Willem Sundberg from the Experimenta Typographica. We have here an H, a collage by J.P. Williams, and an E by Paul Elliman from his photo booth series, which is extremely influential to me throughout the kind of 90s. We have here a Q by Robin Cameron. It's a beautiful cyanotype, a U, which is a type sample from the 1930s for Ur type, a sculpture by Vivian Griffin, an I that's almost hated, a C by Jean-Francois Bory, K, which is a custom limited edition typeface by Commercial Type called Tanya. We have a B by Victor Kopp, which in many ways is actually the kind of impetus for this entire show. An which is a letterpress by Karl Martens, an O, which is a tangram by Anna Barham, a W chosen by Matthew Hale, an N, which is a poster by Suki and Min. We have an F by Adam Marney, F Magazine. O, a Carlos Amorales postcard that anybody can take. The X book is by Adam Michaels and Glenn Cummings, looking at the history of the X symbol in hardcore punk. We have here a video by Jen Bervin, an artist and poet based in New York. We have a U by Tom McGlynn, which is hijacked from the U-Haul logo and was actually included in Ellen Lupton's Mixing Messages show in 1996 at the Cooper Hewitt. We have an M by Herbert Matter, and we have a PS, which is the only 2-letter ligature, as it were, in this particular iteration of the show, which is the cover of the Primary Structures catalog by Elaine Lustig Cohen. We have participatory O, which grew over the course of the show by Moniker. We have a V by Christine Hill and Folks Boutique. We have an E, again from the photo booth alphabet, by Paul Elliman, and an R also by Tom McGlynn. We have an A, a signed Man Ray book from 1948. We have an L, which is by Colleen Asper and Mareike Kandelaki, a performative letter, an A by Jack Stauffacher, who is now 94 years old and who was the teacher of graphic design in the early 1960s of Mel Bachner, the famous conceptual artist who made the Z in this show. We have a Y, which is a newspaper project by Anna Schuleit-Haber, together with Essen Karol. And then finally, we have a D by Dushko Petrovich from DME, an O by Ed Good and Ed Ruche and Joe Good, and a G by the type designer Ksenia Samarskia, rendered as a banner. There you go. That's the show. And then the show changed to make another pangram, which was actually pack my with 5 dozen liquor jugs. Pack my box with 5 dozen liquor jugs, which I'll have you know is 1 letter less than the Quick Brown Fox. So it's actually more efficient. I really would like to make a petition that we get rid of the Quick Brown Fox and start using pack my box with 5 dozen liquor jugs. If I can have my way, that'll happen. But of course, an influence for this entire project is Georges Perec, the French writer who was member of Oulipo, the workshop for potential literature, and who wrote famously a novel without the letter E, La Disparition. In this case, W, or A Memory of Childhood, which was chosen by the artist Matthew Hale, is probably his most personal book, in which he's trying to deal with his own traumas from the Holocaust, while also dealing with a very particular structure to the writing. And so Matthew decided to include that as the W in our show, and I think it's quite telling. Can you bring back the lights? So our final stop is KP Wechselmann. So for several years at the beginning of projects, I was very interested in what I called method designing, or designing like method acting. What that meant is that I was kind of, it came out of a sense of, on the one hand, insecurity, but also interest in the possibilities of moving beyond one style or approach. And it often meant saying, well, okay, it was like, what would Jesus do? But it was like, well, okay, what would Massimo Vignelli do? Okay, what would Wim Crowell do? Okay, what would, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of, what would Elaine Lustig-Cohen do? And trying to design in that way. I remember Adam hated it. He thought it was terrible. He thought, like, why would you, you have a way you make work, why just make that work? But for me, it was a way to kind of open up the possibility that you might be able to do different things. That there might be, rather than being, there's like one voice or one personality that you have to use, you might be able to approach different ways. And I also realized that my students really didn't have, I was teaching at the University of Connecticut, and I realized that my students didn't have a sense of design history. And so I thought, how can I kind of combine these things? And so as an assignment to them, I invented a fictional designer, KP Wechselmann, who was, that means in German, literally, his last name means man of change. And so this was a designer who kind of moved through all of the major kind of movements of kind of canonical graphic design in the 20th century, living from 1907 to 1987. And I kind of created an entire biography. I invented his story. I wrote, I kind of found somebody who could be a good surrogate for him, and then gave all of the students the assignment to research a particular period of his life and then use that to try and reconstruct works from different periods. So, I mean, it wasn't an entirely successful project, nor were they entirely successful works, but it was a way for me to think about a kind of particular approach to kind of design and its history in a malleable way. So I was actually, a number of years later, and this is probably around 2007 or so, I never thought that the fiction could actually be real. I was in Boston in a bookstore, and I found a book by Klaus Wittkugel, who is, and it was a monograph, and I looked at it and I thought, this is amazing. How do I not know this work? He was an East German graphic designer who lived from 1910 to 1985, and who actually showed, in contrast to his West German contemporaries, a remarkably diverse range of graphic styles. He kind of worked in all different media. He worked in, he made signage, he made identities, he made posters, he made books. He also, I mean, in some ways, I think of him as being one of the first postmodern designers. And he also worked as an exhibition maker and was an advocate of graphic design within education. And there are lots of kind of questions that come in his work, but I ran into this book and then suddenly embarked on a project that's now been almost 8 years of going through his archive, of curating things from his archive, of working with it, of writing things. And it's been a very slow process because I happen to have a couple of other jobs too. But it's like, finally in the last year or two, I've started to publish about his work, I'm working on a book of his work, a monograph that will come out, and also an exhibition that I'm planning for next year in January at P. And in fact, I should say that in some ways, I started P. Probably one of the reasons I started P was because I wanted to do a Klaus Wittkugel exhibition one day, because I thought, this is a designer who really never received his due, because he was a designer under socialism, because of the way that history went, and I want to make sure that something happens with that work. So I'm going to conclude my talk here, and I want to say, in putting together this talk, I realized that, I want to go back to that moment when I failed my Fulbright, as it were, when I never finished that project. And for many years, that really haunted me. But I think that maybe in the last couple of years, I've started to realize maybe I didn't make anything out of that. Maybe that was a detour of sorts, but somehow it's come back. Somehow it's come back into the work I'm doing now. And maybe the question of maybe unfinished is just a matter of time. So that's the end of my talk. I wanted to say I'd love to meet any of you who want to come. Oh, thank you. I'd love to meet anybody who wants to talk further. I'm going to be taking questions in the screening room. I believe you guys all know where it is. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. And have a good evening.